What's up, Alex? You've got Gentle and Lowly lesson number 4. We've just got 2 weeks left in the series. Um, I'll send the notes along with this video in the group me. I would go have the notes with you as you go through this video. Go through them together. The chapters that you're supposed to read are listed at the top, 14, 15, and 16. Make sure you read those. That'll supplement the lesson really well. Your main scripture passages are at the top. Then this week we're switching from talking about Christ the Son to talking about God the Father and his heart towards us. So you're just going to open with a question to get them talking. We open this series up talking about Christ's heart and how he describes it as gentle and lowly. What is one or two words that you would use to describe God the Father, and what maybe most naturally flows out of God's heart? Is it different? Is it the same? What words would you guys maybe use, or what do you think maybe Scripture uses? There could be a huge range of answers that you get there. Let them, take a stab at it with whatever they want. You may get people that catch on and say, we usually think of God as angry or wrathful or judgmental, and some people might say that. It's easy for us to slip into that as Christians. It's definitely how most non-believers think about God, and what we want to do in this lesson is push against that idea. And so once you get all the answers, you can kind of describe just briefly how we maybe get to that idea that God is angry and wrathful and judgmental, and that's what most naturally flows out of him rather than grace and mercy and love. There's two things that I kind of listed. Theologically, we just describe the cross as Jesus needs to come and die to satisfy God's wrath, which is correct and it's biblical, but it plays into this idea that God is wrathful and Jesus is gracious and merciful. And so God was in the sky really angry and wrathful, and Jesus came to kind of fix that problem for us. Which again, he did have wrath. He is just, but it gives this idea that Jesus is one way and God is a different way. And we want to push against that idea. Another way we kind of get this idea is just the Old and New Testament. The Old Testament is full of a lot of stories of God being judgmental and wrathful and executing judgment on the nations. And the New Testament is full of Jesus being loving and kind and merciful. And so again, it just feeds this idea that God is the angry one and Jesus is the nice one, the gracious one. And that's not actually what the Bible presents if we look closely. And so that's what we're going to try to do in this lesson, is biblically push back against that idea that God is most naturally angry and wrathful. We want to see what is at the bottom of God's heart, and is it different than what's at the bottom of Christ's heart. And so we're going to look at some biblical passages to kind of try to fight against that idea. So we're going to open with Lamentations, which is a book that a lot of people don't know a lot about. So you can ask them and see, does anybody know anything about Lamentations? If they do, let them kind of try to explain that. More likely than not, they probably won't know much. But the book is written, you're just going to give a brief intro. The book's written by Jeremiah. He's writing it while Jerusalem is being destroyed by the Babylonians. So they're under attack. They come into Jerusalem. They destroy the temple. They take tons of people into exile into Babylon. And Jeremiah is kind of looking on this scene while he's writing this book, lamenting this scene that he sees, that he knows is a result of God's judgment on Israel for following after other gods. So another brief intro to it is you want to talk about the format of the book, which is not easily discerned in English and different than our writing style in English. So the book, Gentle and Lowly, describes this well. So if you read that, you'll see this in the chapters. It's 5 chapters, Lamentations. The first and second, and then the fourth and the fifth are all 22 verses long, and they're acrostic poems. So the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, and that's how these chapters are organized. Every verse takes a letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it goes all the way through. And then the third chapter, which is right in the middle, is actually 3 acrostic poems stacked on top of one another. So he just goes through the alphabet 3 times, which highlights this is the middle of the book. It's the central theme of the book. It's the most important chapter. And then even more than that, the center and middle verse of that middle chapter would have been seen as being extremely important as well, and heightened, which again is something we don't really do in English, but was definitely important in Hebrew literature. So that's why we're looking at Lamentations 3:33. That's why it's so important. So you're going to read Lamentations 3, and you're going to do 31 through 33 just to give a little bit of context, but try to keep them focused mostly on verse 33. You'll read that and then ask them what they think this verse means, what's it saying. So Lamentations 3:33 says, "For he," which is God, "does not afflict from his heart or grieve the children of men." And so what this is saying is, and you want them to, there's a lot of different answers that they could get, but there's kind of two things you want to direct them towards. One thing that the verse is saying is that God is the one who's inflicting or afflicting Jerusalem. He is behind it. He is sovereign. He's the one that allowed and enabled the Babylonians to come in and destroy the temple and take the people away. And he did that as a result of Israel or Judah's sinfulness. So God is behind it. But number two, this doesn't flow out of his heart. He doesn't afflict from his heart, which is different than we might think. And this is kind of the same idea that's talking about with Jesus' heart being gentle and lowly. It's what most naturally flows out of a person. And what most naturally flows out of God is, at least at this point, not affliction. So he's not sitting up in heaven kind of waiting and anticipating and trigger happy to inflict pain and suffering and punish the nations. This is something that's not necessarily supernatural for it to come out of him. Then you're going to ask them another question. Once you talk about those two things, what does this mean? Why is that important? What does that mean for us? And it means that even though God has to punish wickedness because he's perfectly just, perfectly moral, he wouldn't be able to be a good God if he could see evil and just be indifferent towards it. He has to react to it, and a moral being reacts negatively towards evil. But even though he is the one that inflicts pain and suffering, who gives punishment for wrong behavior, he doesn't find pleasure in doing this. So he's not a God that sits in heaven and is happy to punish and afflict mankind. Ortlund in the book, he calls this kind of God has somewhat of a divine reluctance towards inflicting pain and suffering on people. So he's kind of, while he has to do it because he's moral and he's just, and the universe needs to be just, it's not natural to him. It's not something that he enjoys. He almost is slightly holding back. He really doesn't want to do this. And you see that in the Old Testament. It takes so long, hundreds of years of Israel and Judah disobeying until God actually intervenes and says, enough is enough. I'm going to let this foreign country come in and conquer you guys. His heart's most natural desire is that we would be restored, that we would repent rather than that he would send judgment. And so an objection people can make at this point would be that this is just one text. The Old Testament is full of texts that talk about God's wrath and God's judgment. This is just one verse. Does that really fix our thoughts about what comes out of God most naturally? So you're going to look at these other texts. I would read them in the order that I have listed. Read all four of them at one time. Just get different people to volunteer. It's up to you whether you read one and pause for a second to just make sure everyone understands what you read, or if you read them all and then go back and talk about it. Totally up to you. Let's see. I'm not going to read them all, but we'll see if I can remember what they say. The text in Ezekiel talks about God is basically asking this question about do you think I enjoy inflicting? Do I get pleasure out of inflicting punishment? And the natural connotation of the question is no, I don't enjoy this. This is not something that I'm happy to do. Jeremiah 32:41 I think talks about how he has joy in mercy and forgiveness and extending that to his people. 2 Corinthians 1:3 calls God the Father of mercies. And then Isaiah 28:21 is a really cool text that will need some explaining. So it talks about You would have to read the whole chapter to kind of get the context, but you're just going to summarize that for them. It's in the context of talking about God bringing judgment again on Judah and Israel. And it's saying that this is his strange work and his alien work. And that's the main thing when you ask them what these texts teach us, that we really want them to get out of it. And Ortlund hits on this really well in his book. It's actually the title of one of the chapters, that judgment and punishment is God's strange work, so to speak, that it's not natural. He does do it. He is sovereign. He is in charge. He is good. So he punishes wickedness, but it's his strange work, his alien work that's not natural to him. But 2 Corinthians 1:3 calls him the Father of mercies. That would mean that mercy actually naturally flows out of him. It's not his strange work. It's his natural work. Naturally, God produces mercy. And he doesn't produce judgment and anger and wrath easily and as naturally as he does mercy. And so Ortlund talks about how God's heart kind of even recoils at the thought of judging the nations and punishing the nations. It's not something that he's waiting with anticipation to do. And we want to talk about how, left to ourselves, and naturally many of us might assume the opposite about God, that we think naturally God's work is judgment and punishment, and his strange work is mercy and grace, that it's strange that he actually extends those, and most naturally he's actually angry and judgmental. And the Bible actually flips those, that strange work for God is to be judgmental and angry, and his most natural state is to be merciful, to be gracious. Then we're going to transition to our next kind of major text is Exodus 34, 6-8. Ask them a leading question, see if they can get it. We looked at one text, Matthew 11, in the New Testament that described Christ's heart. Where in the Old Testament does God most clearly describe himself? So not even writers writing to describe who God is, but God himself speaks and says, this is who I am. Where's the chief text that does that in the Old Testament? Somebody might know that. They may have other guesses, but it's Exodus 34, 6-8. This is when God comes and appears before Moses, says he's going to let his goodness pass before Moses. And we get these verses here that talk about God being merciful and gracious and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And so you're going to read that text, explain kind of what's happening, that little background that I just gave you maybe, or let somebody else do that if they know. And then ask them, so Jesus uses those two words, gentle and lowly, to describe himself, or the first two words that God uses, the first two descriptors that God uses to describe himself. And it's merciful and gracious. And then you can kind of tie that back into the beginning question that we asked, that those are not necessarily generally the first two words that we would pick to describe God. So again, tie back. This depends on the answers that you get at the beginning. Some of them may have been negative. Even if they weren't negative, a lot of them were probably about God's greatness, that he is sovereign and he's all powerful and he's all knowing and he's almighty. And these words that describe how great God is are usually the things that come to our mind first. But the thing that came to God's mind first to describe himself was actually not his greatness, but his goodness. And that's hugely important. I stole a quote from earlier in the book that I would like for you to read. It's posted here with quotation marks. It talks about how important it is for us not to just to see how great God is, but that we would see how good God is. And that's actually what changes our hearts. So it says, seeing God's greatness is not actually our greatest need, but seeing his goodness. Seeing only God's greatness, the enmity and opposition of our hearts can remain at its full strength, but with one look at the supreme goodness of God shining into our hearts overcomes our opposition and inclines our souls to God. So this idea that we can look and see that God is great and he's powerful and he's almighty, and we can look at all of that as humans and not change the posture of our hearts. But when we look at God and see that he is good, he's gracious, he's merciful, we see these good attributes of God, that's actually what really reorients our hearts. That's actually what moves us to worship God even more so than how great he is. So then you'll transition to the next phrase that God uses to describe himself, slow to anger. Again, you're trying to lead them, let them chew on this stuff. This is a teaching discussion combination time. So ask them what they think it means to be slow to anger, what they think it means that God is slow to anger. Should be not a difficult question. And then you're going to expound on that. And again, a lot of this is taken from the book, so read those chapters. God being slow to anger means that he's patient and he can put up with a lot before he gets angry. It takes him a while. He's slow to be angry. It says that God actually has to be provoked. Something has to move him into anger. And we see that description all over the Old Testament. Tons and tons of times it says the Lord was provoked to anger. The Lord was provoked to anger, but it never says that he was provoked into being merciful or provoked into being loving. Mercy and love, it seems, naturally pour out of him. And anger, he has to be provoked. Something has to move him into that state because that's not most naturally where he sits. And what's interesting is in the New Testament, you might have someone read this text. The King James Version is actually the only one that uses provoked, but all the words are similar. In Hebrews 24, it says that we should consider how to stir up one another or provoke one another into love. And so it's actually the opposite for God and for humans. We most naturally, we don't have to be provoked too much to be angry. That comes out of us really quickly sometimes. We actually have to be provoked in order to be loving, to be merciful, to be gracious. Something great has to move us into that state of being. And God's the opposite, that it actually takes a lot to make God angry, but it doesn't take much for him to extend grace and for him to extend mercy. That naturally comes out. Then you'll move on to the next description. What does it mean that God is abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness? This is one of the most, if not the most common description of God in the Old Testament. Behind it is one Hebrew word, hesed. You don't have to tell them that, but you can if you want. It's used 246 times in the Old Testament, all the time almost describing who God is. And it just means, a lot of times it's translated as steadfast love or faithfulness or both. It's got this wide range of meaning. And it's somewhat equivalent to what we talked about last week with Jesus. We talked about how Jesus will never cast us out when we come to him. And God's the same way, that this is kind of covenantal love, that he will remain faithful even when we are faithless. He continues, his love continues and perseveres, and it doesn't dissipate or disappear when we've been unloving and unfaithful towards him. And you can see that in the example of the Old Testament with Israel, that though they provoke him over and over and over to anger, he still keeps that steadfast love, that faithfulness with them. He never casts them aside and picks a different nation. He perseveres with Israel, just like he'll persevere with us in our wickedness. Then the last one is that last closing statement talks about he visits the sins of the father onto their children, to the third and the fourth generation, but he gives faithfulness to the 1,000th generation of the father and the mother. Go ahead and read that text. Sorry, I should have had that pulled up to do that more clearly, but read that text and you'll see. So the last statement about visiting the iniquities of the father on their children is kind of initially difficult to hear, and it sounds weird. But put in context, it's actually really comforting. And Ortlund, I think, does a really good job of saying this, that that statement makes sure that all the previous verses are not just a result of God being a pushover and a softy. God is not abounding in steadfast love and slow to anger and merciful and gracious because he doesn't care about sinfulness and about evil. He does care. He cares more than any of us do. But he is that way regardless of how much he cares about sinfulness and about wickedness. And it shows the extent of how far his anger carries versus how far his love and faithfulness carries. And so in comparison with them side by side, his anger extends for 3 or 4 generations, but his love and faithfulness extends 1,000 generations. And so that's, again, just another pointer that most naturally God is loving and faithful and merciful, and he's not most naturally angry and wrathful. And then to wrap up, you're going to go into application. Don't miss this step. Really important. We want to hit this almost always, especially when we're in a lesson like this, which is primarily theology. It's cool. It's good for us to learn about God and who he is, but the ending question is, so what? Why does that matter? What is, I know more about God, so I could describe him a little better, but who cares? How does that actually affect my life? Why is it important for us to see that God isn't the wrathful one and Jesus is the gentle and lowly one, but that God is actually most naturally merciful and gracious? Why is that important? How does that change our lives? And I've listed a couple things here. Let them dwell on that question, think it through. They need to come up with stuff themselves. I've listed a couple for you. Helps us theologically. Like I said at the beginning, we don't want to have these views that God is one way and Jesus is this other way, and then they kind of combine in the Trinity to produce something different, but that they all share divinity. They all share these same characteristics. God is not different in his demeanor towards us than Jesus is. So that's helpful theologically. It also is helpful theologically for us to fight against the Old Testament God being different than the New Testament God. This idea that God is angry in the Old Testament and the New Testament he's not. It helps us, since we're mostly in the Old Testament, to see that God is the same. He's unchanging from the Old Testament to the New Testament still today. And then practically, really fights against this idea that God is like a robot, or that he's this impersonal scale in the skies, which I think is a lot of times how we view God, that he is just this perfectly just God, always holding these scales that go up and down depending on our goodness and our wickedness. And then Jesus is the one that actually tilts the scales in our favor, and that God is just this impersonal scale that's just weighing our deeds, weighing Christ's righteousness. And again, we want to say that God is just, that we're not saying that he's not just and that he doesn't need his wrath to be satisfied. He didn't need the payment of Christ. But we're saying that he's not impersonal. He's not just this impersonal scale robot that has to behave according to his characteristics, and who's indifferent to whether we're saved or whether we're not, whether we know him or not, whether we obey or not, that he actually deeply cares about bringing us to himself. It's painful to him. His heart recoils when he has to inflict pain on humanity. It's not something that he enjoys to do, and his heart is quick to jump to be gracious and merciful and loving towards us. And so we want to view God as personal, and that's been a lot of the theme of this series, to view Jesus as personal. We want to do the same thing with God. He's someone that we can relate to, that we can talk to, that we're not just viewing as this robot that can grant us salvation. And so that should lead us, having this view of God should lead us to relate to him better, talk to him more, come to him more confidently and more easily. We should worship him better, more authentically, knowing who he is. We should trust him more with our lives and with his sovereignty. So, sorry this video was kind of long. It really is a lot to work through. The lessons are fairly lengthy, so be ready for that, especially when you add in question times. Text me or call me if you have any questions, if you want to go over anything more clearly. Be praying for you on Sunday. I think Audrey and I, or at least I, will try to be there on Sunday, support you, hear you teach. So reach out if you need anything, but I'll be praying for you.